Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be with you today for this very interesting and scientifically hot topic that has to do with preprints, what they are, why they're valuable, how do we go about preparing, submitting, and using them. I would like to thank Karger and Nago and University of Turku for this invitation. During the course of this presentation, we will be going through the different aspects as I will show you momentarily, but just a very brief introduction as to who I am. My name is Despina Sanoudou. I'm an associate professor at the Medical School of the University of Athens. My background is in molecular genetics and genomics, currently specializing in pharmacogenomics, and I have worked at the University of Cambridge, the Harvard Medical School, and collaborated with a number of other organizations for research, educational, and publication purposes. So today the agenda will include an introduction to preprints, a history of preprints, the benefits and concerns that are associated with them, and then more details as to how do we go about preparing, submitting, using preprints, and engaging in this entire community that is starting to form. We will touch on preprint licensing and look at what lies ahead in this field. Please allow me to indicate at this point that your questions are more than welcome. We will address them all at the end of this presentation. Feel free to type and send them during the course of the talk or at the end using the questions box that is available through GoToMeeting. So let's start with an introduction to preprints. What is a preprint? Slightly different definitions are encountered when looking at different sources, different databases, but the concept remains the same. So according to PLOS, this would be a version of scientific manuscript that's posted on a public server prior to peer review, and that's a very important point to keep in mind. According to Wiley, paper that is made available publicly via a community preprint server prior to or simultaneously with submission to a journal. So bear in mind that this is an independent process to the submission for publication in a scientific journal and does not officially involve peer reviewing. These are some key characteristics. So how does the traditional publishing model compare to the preprints? On the top of your slide, you can see the classical traditional peer review publication process. So you perform your research, prepare your manuscript, submit it to a journal, it goes through the editor, the reviewers, and then a decision is made as to whether it will be accepted, revised, or rejected. If rejected, it will go through multiple rounds of this process until it's finally reached the targeted audience, and it can be enjoyed by your scientific collaborators and colleagues around the world. Now, in the preprint process, we have the research, the preparation of the manuscript, and then the option to submit to a preprint server where the manuscript is briefly checked for basic aspects, and we will go through them in a minute. And then it becomes publicly available so that people can start reading, commenting on it, and citing it. In parallel or independently of that submission to a preprint server, one can go ahead and submit to a scientific journal for publication. This can take place simultaneously or at different times. A very large number of journals endorse the submission, the prior submission to a preprint server, so that should not be a problem. And we will go through how the two submissions to the preprint server and the scientific journal are harmonized through the course of time. Now, the important point to keep in mind here is that one of the advantages, as we will discuss in more detail later on, of submitting it to a preprint server is that while you wait for your manuscript to be accepted by a scientific journal, you start gaining credit, feedback, and citations for your work. And these not only matter for you personally and your career, but they can also make a difference in the acceptance process by a scientific journal. And we will see again how. So preprint servers, there's a rapidly growing number of them, can be distinguished in two large categories, those that are discipline specific and those that are multidisciplinary. Some examples, and these are only a few of the many examples out there, are listed on this slide. Examples of discipline specific and multidisciplinary preprint servers. However, the list is much longer, as you can see on this slide, which again contains only examples and not the comprehensive list, and more details can be found at the website that is listed at the bottom of this slide. This is a growing list, rapidly growing list of preprint servers that are transforming the way that publications are becoming available. So let's look at an example of what the interface of a preprint server looks like. What will you see when you try to read manuscripts or submit your manuscript in one of those servers? This is an example from the medRxiv Center preprint server. And what you see here, let's start point by point. First of all, you see the title of the manuscript, followed by the author list, just as you would see with any traditional publication in a scientific journal. You then have a clear message stating that this is a preprint, it has not been peer-reviewed, and it reports new medical research that has yet to be evaluated and therefore should not be used to guide clinical practice, given that these are medical publications. This is a disclaimer. Then we have a DOI number, and this is very important because it means that you can that this manuscript can be cited. It has an ID, it can be traced, cited. You can refer to it, use it as a publication. And then at the bottom, you have the listing of the different versions of this manuscript. This is extremely important as well, because considering these are preprints, not officially published in a scientific journal, there may be many different versions that come about in the process of improving it. For example, when you receive different comments from readers of this preprint, comments that you may want to integrate in order to your manuscript, to your work, in order to improve it. Therefore, it's important that this box is there and the information is clear as to which versions are available and which one is the latest. From there on, you have information on the license for the specific preprint, and this is something that you choose when you submit it, and we will discuss it later on. And then you have a button where one can click to view any posts, comments, feedback that has been provided on this manuscript. And again, this is extremely valuable because the reason for posting your preprint is to start having viewers, readers receiving feedback, and this feedback can be valuable for the next steps, both of your research work, but also for the history and the journey of this manuscript towards publication. One of the questions that may come to mind is what happens once you submit the same manuscript for publication in a scientific journal, it gets accepted and published. That's not a problem at all, because automatically this information is added, as you can see on the slide here, is added into the preprint server. So there's a clear message now coming up saying that this manuscript has now been published, and it indicates in which journal and what's the new DOI. So keep in mind that there's a DOI number for the manuscript in the preprint server and a different DOI for the same manuscript once it has been published, and the second DOI will refer to the scientific journal of publication. Now let's briefly look at the history of preprints. How did they come about and what can we learn from the process? As far back as 1961, we have Information Exchange Groups program that was launched by NIH. 30 years later, in 91, we have the arXiv repository that is first launched by Paul Ginsburg and his team of physical scientists. Then in 2002, we have the Budapest Open Access Initiative by OSF that further encouraged the open access publishing of preprints. And then in 2008, we have academia.edu and ResearchGate being established. And from 2010 onwards, we really have booming of the field of preprints with a significant rise both in the number of preprints that are submitted, but also in the number of preprint servers that are available. And you can see examples of how these preprint servers are flourishing in the diagram here from the Science magazine. And you can see basically how from 2014 onwards, there's a major increase in the number of preprints submitted to those servers, and the most impressive one is the one that the growth that you see for the bioRxiv. So you see how the number of preprints submitted there has dramatically increased over the last few years and keeps increasing. But what are the benefits and what are the concerns with preprints? Where do we stand today? What can we enjoy? And what are the concerns that we would like to still see addressed? There's a long list of benefits that I would like to go through because really there's a lot to gain by using preprint servers. First of all, it ensures the open and rapid dissemination of information as compared to traditional publishing. As soon as you submit it, after a very short period of basic checks, your manuscript becomes publicly available. And that does not involve any fees, so it's freely available to anyone really to search and read. This may change once your manuscript has been published, in that whichever journal publishes it may require a fee to allow access to your work. So having it in a preprint server definitely enables the free circulation of this information. It's very important in that it helps in establishing priority precedence for the work, because you can make it publicly available so much faster than with any traditional publication process. So really, it makes sure that the world, in a way, knows that you are the first to discover and publish this work. Very important is that it provides you with an opportunity to receive rapid feedback from a very, very broad audience that may lead to significant improvements in the final published version of your work. So as soon as your preprint becomes publicly available, you may start receiving comments and feedback and valuable critique from people in the same discipline or other disciplines all over the world, really. And it's up to you to look at it, assess it, respond to it, and even incorporate it in your work. There are cases, there are real world, real life examples out there of new authors being added to manuscripts because they provided valuable comments in preprints that they saw and ended up collaborating with those teams and becoming authors in those manuscripts that they commented on. So the scientific contribution can be major. Preprints definitely allow in that way to find new research collaborators and expand one's professional network, because it allows a more direct interaction with the authors of a manuscript. It's easier to comment on their work, to get an answer potentially from them, and to start an interaction that may lead to a long-lasting collaboration. Preprints can now be used to support grant and job applications. And that's very important, because when you're trying to apply for a grant, you often don't have the luxury of time to wait for the several months or maybe even a year or more that it may take for a traditional publication to come out, for your manuscript to be accepted by a scientific journal. but you will want to include this completed work in a grant application or in your application for a job. So many funding bodies now, as well as many organizations with openings, job openings, are accepting the listing of preprints that you may have. Another important point is that it will attract more attention and consequently a higher number of citations to your work. And this is important not only because it gives you credit and looks good for your work, but importantly because these numbers, this response that your preprint will get, may often be taken into consideration, into serious consideration, by whichever scientific journal you're trying to publish to. And therefore it could facilitate the faster publication of your work at an even more prestigious journal. And if your preprint gets negative criticism, it will give you the opportunity to address this and improve your work before submitting it to a scientific journal. So it's a gain-gain really situation. Also, because it allows for all this interaction, scientific interaction, it works as a peer review training platform for junior scientists and early career researchers. For example, preprints are wonderful material to be used in journal clubs. They're wonderful material to practice with in reading, looking at the comments they receive by either other senior scientists, commenting on them yourself, discussing with your fellow young scientists or junior faculty the advantages and disadvantages and limitations or strong points of a preprint, and practice on how this could be improved. Therefore, learning how when it comes to writing your own manuscript, you could do an even better job right from the start. So it's a way for all of us to learn from each other, a much more interactive way and user-friendly way. The influence of preprints, it's major, and you can see in this seemingly complex but highly informative diagram on this slide all the different aspects that preprints can influence. So they provide open access, promote open science, they allow for revisions, multiple revisions, and therefore improvements of your work. They allow for rounds of corrections, feedback from all sorts of different scientists around the world. They welcome negative results, which may have otherwise had a very small chance of being published in a prestigious journal. They enable community review. They increase reproducibility, increase communication in science. They complement the journal peer review process because any comments you may have received may be taken into consideration by peer reviewers when you submit your manuscript to a scientific journal. They promote collaboration and actually greatly facilitate the initiation of such collaborations. They're useful in informing funders of the progress of your work in a much faster fashion. They promote diversity and can support the advancement of in your career steps. It is interesting to observe how preprints were treated in the course of the pandemic we're all faced with. In these two informative diagrams, what you see is in the upper part, the course of COVID and the WHO declarations. So you see how around March 9th last year, WHO declared COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic, and you see how the number of cases and unfortunately deaths increased thereafter. Now at the bottom diagram, interestingly, you will see how around the same time, the number of journal articles and preprints started booming. And these are articles and preprints on COVID. So you see what an important role preprints played in this process because they were a much faster way to circulate findings, observations, and enable the advancement of our scientific understanding of this pandemic. the basis, the clinical effects, etc. It was very interesting if you put in Google Scholar the keywords COVID-19 and medRxiv, or if you look into different preprint servers, you see how many publications have actually come out on COVID, and these are preprint publications. So this was a fantastic way to expedite the communication of scientific findings, especially in a moment of crisis such as this of our pandemic. Needless to say, of course, there are concerns that people have related to preprints. Some of them are well-founded. Some of them, however, do not really hold true, at least not anymore. So some of the key concerns in people's minds are the lack of quality assurance due to the absence of formal peer review, which is a fact. Of course, the counter-argument is that it's open for review and commenting by the entire world. Two is the premature reporting of non-peer-reviewed scientific findings in the media that may lead to the promotion of fake news. And indeed, this is an aspect that it needs great caution, a lot of attention, how media use this information and circulate this information to avoid misleading the public. Another fear that people have is that preprints may be considered prior publication and therefore pose a risk for the acceptance of their completed manuscript to a scientific journal. So they're concerned of breaking the Ingelfinger rule, really, that requires that no prior publication of this work exists. However, an increasing number of journals, a very large number of journals already, encourage or at least accept preprints before publication in their journals. So this does not really hold true anymore, although it's important to check with the journals that you're interested in submitting prior to sending a preprint to a preprint server. Another fear is this of being scooped due to the release of your manuscript prior to its official publication, and indeed increasing measures are being taken to avoid this scooping process. But after all, as soon as your preprint is out there, it does have a DOI, and it does establish the fact that you are the first one to get these data, this scientific knowledge out there. So this again should not really be much of a concern. Now, what is the process of submitting and using preprints? Let's look at it in a bit of more detail. How do you go about doing it? The first and foremost thing to bear in mind is that given that a preprint will not go through official peer review, it is your responsibility to ensure the highest possible quality. So although it sounds like a preliminary version of a manuscript, I dare say that it needs to be an extremely well prepared piece of work, because it will become publicly available, it will be openly accessible to anyone, and it will be open for criticism, comments, feedback, etc. So it is your responsibility to ensure the highest quality of research, of data presentation, and of manuscript preparation, both at the way that is presented, the way it's structured, the way it's edited, etc. It's very important that the preprints meet all ethical standards. It does not contain, for example, patient information, identifiers. It has no issues related to dual use of research. It has not been published elsewhere before in its entirety or in parts. Appropriate permissions must have been obtained for any proprietary data, figures, images, patents, etc. And you must consider what would be the best preprint server. That would be step 3 if you want. The best preprint server, the best fit for your research. Would you go for a multidisciplinary one? Would you go for a discipline specific? What would be the best audience for this work? And of course, as with all traditional publications, it is important that all co-authors have been informed, they've been given time to look at, assess, agree with the manuscript and agree with its submission to a preprint server. So ensuring the highest quality is something that I would like to really stress. Critical appraisal of the results, ensuring reproducibility, validation, quality of figures, manuscript structure, flow of text, objective conclusions, and very careful editing are just a few of the very important responsibilities that lie in your hands when you go for a preprint server prior to peer review and the official publication path. Because all these will be subject to, like I said, assessment by a very, very broad audience, the broader scientific community. So do your best and be as critical as you can to yourself and to your findings. Some tips now for successful preprint submission. First of all, they should be posted before journal submission to allow additional feedback from the community that you can then use to improve your manuscript. Authors should use their ORCID IDs to verify the identity of other authors and declare their contributions. It's important to ensure choosing recognized, credible, and resourceful preprint servers that will provide an appropriate DOI. And you should always keep in mind what your target audience is. Who do you anticipate to be interested in this work so that you can make it easier for them to come across, to find your work, your manuscript, when they go about searching for this information. Carefully check the policies of the preprint server that you intend to submit to. Not all servers, the same as with journals, not all journals have the same policies. So make sure that you prepare your work accordingly and you carefully follow their submission steps. The preprint title and abstract should accurately convey the outcomes of the research work pretty much in the same way as you would do with the traditional publication. And I'm mentioning this again because it's important. Just because it's a preprint, it does not mean that you can submit it without the agreement of the co-authors. It's absolutely necessary. Their feedback, their opinion, and their full consent is required before you go ahead with submission of a preprint. And a link to the preprint should be added at the end of the published article once you go through with the traditional path and have your manuscript accepted by a scientific journal. Now, what's the actual process once you submit your preprint? What happens? First of all, you need, as I mentioned, to carefully follow the survey guidelines and recommendations as they are prepared for all authors submitting manuscripts and supplementary files. And if you do not follow them, you will be asked by the preprint server people to go back and revise accordingly. The preprints are then screened by experts for any offensive or non-scientific content, anything that would be inappropriate in a scientific publication. And then they're scrutinized for any material that may pose a biosecurity or a health risk. Then they're checked for any plagiarized content. And if everything is satisfactory, then they are accepted, deposited, and they become citable, cannot be withdrawn. That's very important to bear in mind, but revisions can be submitted, and then they will appear, as I showed you earlier, in the server interface. So anyone can go there and find previous versions of your manuscript. But keep in mind, it's extremely important. You cannot withdraw it. It will be there. And that's why it makes it extremely important that you pay very careful, a very close attention to all the different points that we just discussed in the previous slides in terms of quality in the preparation and submission of your preprint. Now, some recommendations for the authors of preprints. Practice responsible research. Your preprint will become widely publicly available. Involve experts from the initial stages of the research process. Involve them in your work so that you can get their feedback, you can get them engaged, and you can ensure the highest quality both of the research process, the interpretation, the presentation process, as well as the write-up process of your manuscript. Communicate very carefully with the media, if you have to communicate with the media, about your own preprints or other people's preprints, and be very careful in your critique to other people's work. Everything and anything you say needs to be to have strong foundations, strong scientific foundations. And another tip that's actually very helpful is to become an active reviewer of preprints in your own area of expertise. This will give you tremendous experience in looking out for ways to improve a manuscript, and this experience can then easily be applied in your own manuscripts when the time comes to prepare them. Along with preprints and preprint servers, another concept has come along, and this is the concept of preprint reviewing. So you have organizations now that undertake preprint reviewing. These are journal-independent review services for preprints, and they allow one to get feedback so as to improve their manuscript. What happens when you send your preprint to a preprint reviewing organization is that your preprint, if accepted for reviewing, will be reviewed by a team comprising of recognized and distinguished experts in the field, associate editors, and external reviewers. Now, there's an increasing number of such organizations, and just 3 examples are presented here in this slide. So what does preprint reviewing actually entail? How does it work? Once you have your manuscript prepared, you can send it to the preprint server where it's deposited, it gets a DOI, and then if you have different versions, you submit the different versions just as we discussed. Now, if you want, you can choose to submit the initial version after it's been submitted to a preprint server. You can choose to send it for preprint reviewing. Now, the organization you will choose, for example, in this slide is the PCI, will look at this preprint, determine if they want to go ahead with reviewing it or not, and if they agree, then the manuscript is peer-reviewed and an official report with the reviewer comments becomes available. Now, if they have recommendations or if they consider it acceptable, the report they provide will indicate this information accordingly. And then this report can accompany your preprint in the preprint server, in a way certifying that it has been peer-reviewed. Here are the peer reviewer comments, and you can go ahead to address them and improve your manuscript, or just post them if they're comments that should just be announced and do not require any action on your behalf. And of course, there is the scenario where they may recommend rejection, in which case you're left with the versions of the manuscript as you have posted them on the preprint server, but without such a peer reviewer report to support your submission in the preprint server. Benefits of preprint reviewing. I'm sure you can imagine many of them. So authors can submit all types of articles with no restrictions on format, article length, number of tables or figures. They may seek feedback on preprints reporting negative findings, something that would be quite challenging through the traditional publication approach. They can get the preprint reviewed for absence of plagiarism, conflict of interest, compliance with ethical standards, so they can get feedback from experts on this. They may submit their manuscript to the target journal of choice along with the peer reviewing report that has been generated, therefore making a stronger case for the editor and possibly serving as a way to facilitate the peer review process. So this report that comes from preprint reviewing may or may not be taken into consideration by the scientific journal where you will submit your manuscript later on. But an increasing number of journals will be willing to look at it and take it into consideration. And then authors may get the editorial process, including recommendations for the preprint, indexed in the respective servers. Now let's look at some preprint policies among journals and funders. Where do things stand and how are things evolving in this field? There are some important innovations by journals in order to support the concept and the process of preprints. So some journals already have designated preprint editors. What do these do? Preprint editors are assigned the responsibility to look at preprints in different preprint servers and identify pieces of work that look highly interesting, promising, and relevant to the journal's scope. Therefore, they can reach out to the authors of a preprint and encourage them, invite them to submit to their journal. So there are scenarios, there are cases, real-life cases, where scientists received multiple invitations to send their manuscript to different journals because they had made it publicly available to preprint servers and it caught the attention of preprint editors. Another aspect is inviting submissions from preprint servers more actively, more directly, as I mentioned, integrating the preprint comments into the reviewing process. And this could both expedite the reviewing process, but also facilitate it considerably for everyone involved. Then we have the preprint reviewing process that is endorsed more and more by different journals. The PRE review, which basically encourages the interaction between those submitting their manuscript and those providing comments or feedback or questions, etc. There are considerable efforts taking place to provide extended scoop protection, as this is one of the major concerns that people may have when considering the option of submitting a preprint. It's important and journals are paying close attention to this to ensure that there are links to the previous versions of the same manuscript so that there is no confusion as to whether it's the same or different manuscripts, which one's the final version, which one should be cited, etc. And there are some journals that are even offering discounts to manuscripts that have been submitted to preprint servers before being sent for publication in the specific scientific journals. So there's more and more innovations taking place by different scientific journals to support, to encourage the use of preprints. Some of the journals that are endorsing these innovations and encourage preprints are listed in this slide, but obviously this is a limited list aimed at serving as an example. What about funding bodies? How do they feel about preprints? And again here, the good news is that they're seeing it favorably. They're taking this information more and more into consideration, and others even actively encourage it. So in general, they're increasingly recognizing the value of preprints and permit them to be included for assessment in your publication list. NIH in specific is encouraging the inclusion of preprints in grant applications and reports, and specifically states so. The Wellcome Trust is supporting the inclusion again in grant applications and end of grant reports, where you want to show how productive you've been thanks to the funding you received. And it's important that you're able to do this as your grant is coming to an end or as soon as it's been completed. Now, if a manuscript requires several months or a year to be published, you would have not been able to inform the funding body of your achievements unless you use preprints. You submit in preprint service. And then for another example, the Human Frontiers Science Program has given approval for listing preprints on all applications and reports. So these are just examples from major funding organizations as to how they see the whole concept and how they want to incorporate it in their routine practice. There's many other examples of funders that support preprints. These examples are listed here, but again, the list is much longer. Of course, you can always check with the funding body that you intend to apply to what's their take on preprints and if they accept them to be listed in applications or not. Now, what about preprint licensing? This would be a fairly long topic to go through, but I would like to provide you with the basics at least, because it's an important aspect to be able to address when you submit to a preprint server. So there's different types of preprint licenses, and important that you're able to and knowledgeable so as to choose the preprint license that you wish, you and your co-authors. So there's the CCO waiver, which allows anyone to repost or reuse your preprint in any medium for any purpose, even without attributing it to you. There's the CC BY that allows anyone to repost or reuse your preprint in any medium for any purpose, but requires the user to provide attribution and a backlink to the original material. There's the CC BY SA that requires adaptations of the material. For example, the modification of the figure that was taken from your manuscript in order to be released under the same license. There's the CC BY NC that prohibits commercial use of the material. For instance, republishing a figure from your preprint in a paywall journal, or using the preprints to advertise products. There's the CC BY ND, which prohibits the sharing of adaptations of the material, for instance, translating the preprint to other language or creating a preprint copy with extensive annotations. And then there's the no license, which does not grant default permission to reuse the work beyond what is required to post the preprint. For more information and details, there's a valuable resource, and this would be the Sherpa Romeo, where you have information on journal copyrights and archiving policies, so that you have more detail about the different licensing information and how they can be used and how they're used by different journals. So if licensing is an aspect that you want to learn more about, I would encourage you to visit this database, get more information, and possibly read more about licensing before you decide what license to attribute to your preprint. But where do we go from here? What future lies ahead for preprints? There's a number of challenges that need to be addressed in the preprint world, if you want. Some of these are listed here and have to do with metadata, discoverability, how can search engines easily find those preprints, the full text format, licensing aspects. There are aspects that have to do with preprint evolution, how to best keep track of different versions, how to show the changes from one versions to the other. Do we use different tracking or not? How should this be presented? Retractions and corrections. Will we continue with the no withdrawal option, or will there be options to retract, to correct, to change? How should these be made publicly available? How should they be announced? What about checks and screening? Should this be extended? Should this be more elaborate? These are all open questions that different preprint servers, and not only the servers, need to address, to tackle, and I anticipate we will see them evolving over the near future. Scientific commentaries, reviews, comments, recommendations. What's the best way to present them? What's the best way to organize them so that people can access them, view them, and use them in the best possible way? Related data, again, how should they be linked to the manuscript? What about metrics and impact? Currently, preprints and their citations are not taken into consideration, for example, when calculating the H-index. But where do we go from here? Can you take into consideration both the citations of a preprint and the final publication? Or will these be different sets of citations, and how will they be counted towards, for example, your CV? Should there be alternative metrics? Should there be ways to handle the citations of different versions? There's many complex issues that arise, but I'm sure we will have answers in the near future. Now, some tips for improving the quality of preprints would be for preprint servers to help authors understand better how to report, share, and update their preprints. Authors should potentially consider or be encouraged to mandatorily make their research data available with only few exceptions. Preprint servers could encourage data availability through data transfer agreements to ensure that people don't get scooped, their work doesn't get scooped. And it would be useful to provide links to study registrations, protocols, analysis plans, versions of records. It would help to link preprints to external review platforms that specialize in preprint reviewing, so that this whole process would be streamlined in a more organized fashion. So these would be all recommendations for preprint servers, really suggestions for the improvement of preprint servers. But there are some more things to bear in mind, or at least to encourage preprint servers to share with them points that could be improved. Authors and reviewers should be given incentives, for example, in the form of budgets or recognition on platforms like Publons for increased visibility. This would be an incentive to encourage more authors to participate. They could automate the quality check of preprint reports. They could link preprint to versions of records and indicate when a preprint represents a submitted manuscript. As I mentioned earlier, this is the case in some preprint servers, but not necessarily always. It may not always be an automated process. The preprint metadata should be improved and shared with stakeholders, such as Crossref, Open Citation Corpus, etc. And a comprehensive screening report of the preprint should be provided. This would be helpful to all. So where do preprints go from here? Well, launching preprint overlay journals with lower publishing costs, major improvements to the preprint infrastructure is needed, anticipated, and will take place. It's a matter of time. Incorporation of preprints into scholarly and publisher workflows, provision for production of preprints in starter-based formats, and greater consideration of preservation services. Now, developing the next generation of preprints and institutional repositories is eagerly awaited and sure to come very soon. So there's many aspects that are left to be desired, but major advantages that preprints have brought to our scientific life. They are here to stay, and some people go as far as saying that submitting a preprint and having your preprint reviewed could become equivalent to a publication in a scientific journal, and therefore stopping the publication process there without going ahead to submit to a scientific journal. That's an opinion that is stated by some people. History will show if this will become the norm or it will remain an option to authors. So with that, our talk comes to an end.